Welcome. With this video, we begin an examination of malware and cyber attacks. Malicious software or malware is software that has somehow entered a computer system and compromises the CIA triad that we discussed earlier. Recall that the CIA refers to the three security objectives for information and information systems: confidentiality, integrity, availability. Malware constitutes one of the most significant categories of threats to computer systems. In this section, we'll examine some of the forms of malware, explain how malware enters a computer system, and how malware puts a computer and the data on that computer at risk. Malware is a generic term for software that has a malicious purpose. It may take many different forms. It could, for example, be a virus attack, a worm, adware, Trojan horse, spyware. Here we present a definition from NIST. They say that malware is a program that is inserted into a system, usually covertly, with the intent of compromising the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of the victim's data, applications, or operating system, or otherwise annoying or disrupting the victim. The system that is being infected here is referred to as the host, and we'll use that term in further discussions. Note that malware poses a threat to application programs, utility programs that are used just to get your job done, such as editors and compilers, and kernel-level programs, something that is at the heart of the operating system. Thus, malware constitutes perhaps the most prevalent danger to a computer system. Some of the terminology we mention in this section refers to various types of attacker tools that might be delivered to a host by malware. These tools allow attackers to have unauthorized access to or use of infected hosts and their data, or they enable the attacker to launch attacks. The first term we present is advanced persistent threat. This term refers to cybercrime that is directed at business and political targets. With respect to advanced persistent threat, these cybercrimes are really the consequence of our growing dependence on technology. Adware refers to advertising that's integrated into software. It can result in pop-up ads or redirection of a browser to a commercial site. Remember, in the NIST definition, it did not say that malware exclusively causes harm, but could cause an annoyance. That could be one of the aspects of adware. And then the attack kit. This is a set of tools for generating new malware automatically using various supplied propagation and payload mechanisms. We'll discuss all of this in more detail as we go along. I wanted to introduce you to some of the terminology that will make our later presentation easier to understand. When we hear of software such as an attack kit, this suggests that people are developing tools to assist other people in using malware. Turns out that cybercrime has become a very profitable business. A backdoor or trapdoor is any mechanism that serves to bypass a normal security check. It allows unauthorized access to functionality in a program or onto a compromised system. It's a secret entry point into a program that allows someone who is aware of its existence to gain access without going through the usual security access procedures. Programmers have used backdoors legitimately for many years. They use them to debug and test programs. Such a backdoor is called a maintenance hook. You may recall a movie with Matthew Broderick, War Games. This was one of the key points that this high school student was able to exploit to get into the system and affect the NORAD. Another term is bot. This is short for robot. It's a device that's been infected by malware and has become part of a network of infected devices controlled by an attacker. A botnet is really a network of bots. It's a collection of internet-connected devices that are infected and, again, controlled by someone else through some type of malware. Drive-by download is an attack using code in a compromised website that exploits a browser vulnerability to attack a client system when the site is viewed. A drive-by download is an unintended download of malicious software. No action need be taken by a user to cause this download to occur. Some additional terms include exploits, which would be code specific to a particular vulnerability or set of vulnerabilities. Flutters, a DOS client. This is a denial of service client. This would be used to generate a large volume of data to attack network computer systems. The idea here is, we go back to CIA, this affects A, availability. And finally, keyloggers. This is software that captures the keystrokes on a compromised system. As someone is typing something in, such as a user ID and password, that information could be captured and then sent back to some adversary. Logic bomb would be code inserted into malware by an intruder, and it lies dormant for some time. Either some time period ticks off the clock or some event occurs and this bomb becomes active. A macro virus. This is a type of virus that uses macro or scripting tools. Sometimes you'll see things like Office software, word processors, for example, that might have a convenient set of commands that we execute repeatedly, so a macro is created. This is an environment where you might see a macro virus. Note that these viruses are typically embedded in a document and triggered when the document is viewed or edited to run and then replicate itself into other such documents. Mobile code. This is software that can be shipped unchanged to a heterogeneous collection of platforms and execute with identical semantics. Note that once a virus is on your system, it can do anything that any legitimate program can do. That means it could potentially delete files, change system settings, or cause some kind of other harm. A rootkit. This would be a set of hacker tools used after the attacker has broken into a computer system and gained what is called root-level access. If you're familiar with Unix or Linux operating systems, the term root comes to play. Root is the user who is the system administrator. So when we talk about root-level access, this is giving you access to administrative functions. So a rootkit is a collection of tools that a hacker uses to mask intrusion and obtain administrator-level access to a computer or computer network. The intruder installs a rootkit on a computer after first obtaining user-level access, either by exploiting a known vulnerability or cracking a password. The rootkit could then collect user IDs and passwords to other machines in the network. This would give the hacker root or privileged access. Spammer programs are used to send large volumes of unwanted mail. Spam is defined as unwanted or unsolicited email sent out to multiple parties. While it's often used for marketing purposes, it can be used for malicious purposes. As an example, spam is a common way to spread a virus or worm. Spam is also used to send emails enticing recipients to visit what we call phishing websites in order to steal the recipient's identity. So in one way, spam can be harmless but annoying. When used maliciously, spam is a vehicle for spyware, viruses, worms, and phishing attacks. Spyware is software that collects information from a computer and transmits it to another system by monitoring keystrokes, screen data, possibly network traffic, or by scanning files in the system for sensitive information. Virus is malware that, when executed, tries to replicate itself into another executable machine or script code. When it's successful, that code is said to be infected. The infected code, when it's executed, causes the virus to execute. A Trojan horse. This is a program that appears to have a useful function, but also has a hidden or potentially malicious function that evades security mechanisms, sometimes by exploiting legitimate authorizations of a system that involves the Trojan horse program. Now, the term Trojan is a very general term, or malware of a variety of different forms can qualify as being a Trojan. For example, a Trojan banker program would be designed to steal account data for online banking systems, e-payment systems, credit or debit cards. Then we have things like Trojan downloaders, Trojan dropper, Trojan game thief, Trojan IM, Trojan ransom, and the list goes on. So Trojan is kind of a generic term, again, that refers to a variety of different malware similar to what we've described here for a Trojan horse. Let's consider a couple more terms. A worm is a computer program that can run independently and propagate a complete working version of itself onto other hosts on a network. This is accomplished quite often by exploiting software vulnerabilities. Now, propagation refers to the way that malware spreads. We'll discuss this in some detail in just a bit. Also, the software vulnerabilities will be addressed in a bit more detail shortly. A zombie, a bot, or a drone. These three names are often considered to refer to the same thing. This would be a program activated on an infected machine that is activated to launch attacks on other machines. We've talked briefly about bots already. Let's note that malware that effectively takes over the computational and network resources of a system is known as a bot, a robot, or a zombie or a drone. Because the infected system is attached to the internet, the malware uses that computer to launch or manage attacks, making it difficult to trace to the creator of the bot. The bot is usually planted on multiple computers, perhaps hundreds or thousands of computers, effectively creating a robot network. In this way, both the integrity and availability of the affected system are affected. So how does malware initially enter a system? Well, logically, a cyber attack starts with what's called a vulnerability discovery. This is where the adversary finds some weakness that can be exploited and used to intrude into the victim's system. An experienced hacker will likely attempt to discover information about a target prior to actually attempting an attack. This is similar to a bank robber acquiring knowledge about a bank's alarm systems, number of guards, police response time, and so on. It's kind of like the idiom casing the joint. A hacker will want to know about your system's security. Turns out that much information can be found easily on the internet without even attaching to the target system. The weakness that's discovered may be a zero-day vulnerability in either software or hardware, or the use of passwords that are not modified for a long time and easy to uncover through a brute force type of attack. A zero-day exploit is a cyber attack that occurs on the same day a weakness is discovered in software. At that point, it is exploited before a fix becomes available from its creator. That's the notion of exploiting the zero-day vulnerability. The idea is that this vulnerability or weakness was identified before the software developer could actually address the issue. Now, cybersecurity involves technology, people, and process. Vulnerability refers to weaknesses in software or hardware systems. It also refers to processes, policy, and the human component of an organization. As we just noted, cyber vulnerability includes weaknesses in software or hardware, a technical vulnerability. If the weakness involves process, policy, or humans, this is referred to as an operational vulnerability. There are databases that store information about vulnerabilities. These vulnerabilities tend to be technical vulnerabilities. The National Vulnerability Database, NVD, can be accessed using the URL I've given here. I'll access that in a moment to demonstrate how we could examine information about a vulnerability. Of the two categories of vulnerabilities, technical and operational, note that within an organization, the operational vulnerabilities are often the weakest link. These present the opportunity for cyber criminals. Typical cyber attack targeting these weakest links is social engineering. This deceives users in an organization and allows the adversary to gain a foothold into the system. Following the link that I gave you to the NVD database will bring up this page. On this home page, notice the definition of vulnerability. A weakness in the computational logic found in software and hardware components that, when exploited, results in a negative impact to confidentiality, integrity, or availability. Mitigation of the vulnerabilities in this context typically involves coding changes, but could also include specification changes or even specification deprecations. I'm just going to hit a few points about the content of this website to give you an idea of what's available here. If we go to the menu in the upper right corner and under vulnerabilities, select categories, what I'd like to do is scroll through this and show you that there are several entries here describing various vulnerabilities. I have a particular one in mind that I'd like to show you, so I'll just do a quick search for this on the page. This brings us to CWE 20, improper input validation. The explanation is the product does not validate or incorrectly validates input that can affect the control flow or data flow of a program. This is a hyperlink. If I click on it, we'll get a little bit more information. You can examine the information here, but I'd like to point out the examples that are presented if we scroll down. The first example relates to a shopping interaction in which the user is free to specify the quantity of items to be purchased and then a total is calculated. The comment is that the user has no control over the price variable. However, the code does not prevent a negative value from being specified for quantity. So if an attacker were to provide a negative value, then the user would have their account credited instead of debited. Might be a good place to go shopping. The second example, ask the user for a height and width for an M×N game board with a maximum dimension of 100 squares. The comment here is that while the code checks to make sure the user cannot specify large positive integers and consume too much memory, again, it does not check for negative values supplied by the user. And you can read more about the details here. Is this all hypothetical? Well, I wish that it was, but I recall working on a large mainframe system many years ago where the system was brought down repeatedly in a short time span. This was not an attack. It was just improper coding in terms of doing input validation. Application developers were writing their code in a high-level language and invoking the service of an assembly language subroutine. The assembly language subroutine was perhaps as much at fault as the high-level language application code. What happened is if the application did not select certain fields, then the value for the size of those fields was passed as 0. What happened in the assembly language subroutine is it just assumed that it was passed a valid positive integer and used an instruction called execute. And what execute did was to invoke a machine instruction, and machine instructions tend to have the length underspecified. For example, something that is a length of 1 will have a value of 0 in the machine instruction. Well, immediately what it did was it took the length that it received, assuming it was positive, and subtracted 1 from it to make it conform to the slot within the machine instruction. So if the length is 0 and you subtract 1, suddenly we've got a problem, because now when it executes, it's actually executing with a very different size than what had been intended. And it actually caused the entire teleprocessing system to come down. I say it came down repeatedly because what happened was the user on the other end who was running the application had no idea what was going on. So when the system was restored to operation, simply ran the application again, did not specify certain data items, resulting in a length of 0 being passed from the application that they were running into the assembly language program, and again, the system came down. I think it was about 4 times, and then finally the user probably realized cause and effect that he or she might actually be causing the system to come down in some way, and kind of threw in the towel and called it a day. But the point is, something simple like input validation, if overlooked, can cause serious consequences when discovered as a vulnerability. Let's consider how malicious software spreads. While early malware tended to use a single means of propagation to deliver a single payload, as it evolved, we experienced growth of a blended malware that incorporates a range of both propagation mechanisms and payloads that increase its ability to spread, hide, and perform a range of actions on targets. So the propagation mechanisms include infection of an existing executable or interpreted content by viruses, exploit of software vulnerabilities, either locally or over a network, by worms or drive-by downloads, social engineering attacks that convince users to bypass security mechanisms to install Trojans or to respond to phishing attacks. We've used the term blended, and what we mean by a blended attack is this type of attack uses multiple methods of infection or propagation to maximize the speed of contagion and the severity of the attack. So what does malware actually do? Payload actions performed by malware, once it reaches a target system, can include corruption of system or data files, theft of service in order to make the system a zombie agent of attack, part of a botnet, theft of information from the system, typically things like login credentials, but also other personal details captured through keylogging or spyware programs. Stealthing, where the malware hides its presence on the system from attempts to detect and block it. The term payload used here refers to the malicious software introduced to a system. With respect to action, we refer to the behavior of this software once it establishes itself on the system. Historically, looking at the way malware was introduced, it required considerable technical skills by these adversaries. But with the advent of these attack kits, it's made it easy for someone with less technical proficiency to be able to perhaps develop malware and distribute it. Development of virus creation toolkits in the early 1990s and more general attack kits in the 2000s greatly assisted in the development and deployment of malware. These toolkits are often referred to as crimeware. These include a variety of propagation mechanisms and payload modules that even someone with little technical proficiency can deploy. We note some of the common examples: Zeus, Angler, spyware, and poison ivy. We'll examine a couple of these in just a moment. Note that attack kits can also easily be customized with the latest discovered vulnerabilities in order to exploit the window of opportunity between the publication of a weakness and the widespread deployment of patches to close it. These kits then greatly enlarge the population of attackers able to deploy malware. We mentioned Zeus as one of the crimeware toolkits. Zeus was the king of Greek gods. As malware, Zeus is the king of the Trojans. Zeus is designed to steal information related to the system it compromises. This includes login credentials and details related to banks. This malware might intercept web pages and insert extra fields, such as a date of birth, to a banking web page that originally only requested username and password. Angler is another example. This was first seen in 2013, and it was the most active kit seen in 2015. It often is distributed using malvertising. It's sophisticated and technically advanced both in attacks executed and countermeasures deployed to resist detection. Although we've identified only 2 attack kits here, there are several other attack kits that are actively being used, though the specific kits change from year to year as attackers continue to evolve and improve them. So how does an attack work? Here's an example of what a malware toolkit can do. First, the toolkit sends spam to users, attempting to trick them into visiting a website. Users are lured to this website, they visit the site contains malicious content provided by the toolkit. The website then infects the user's computers with Trojan horses provided by the toolkit. This is exploiting vulnerabilities in the computer's operating system. The Trojan horses install attacker tools such as keystroke loggers and rootkits, again provided by the toolkit. So who conducts the attack? More recent attack sources have included politically motivated attackers, criminals, organized crime, organizations that sell their services to companies and nations, also national government agencies. But historically, malware development was attributed to individual attackers who wished to demonstrate their technical competence to their peers. But over time, we see that it has evolved into more organized and dangerous attack sources. This transformation has significantly changed the resources available and the motivation behind the rise of malware, leading to the development of a large underground economy involving the sale of attack kits access to compromised hosts, and to stolen information. Let's examine something called an Advanced Persistent Threat, or an APT. Advanced Persistent Threats are not a new type of malware. An advanced persistent threat is a type of cyber attack in which the attacker gains and maintains unauthorized access to a targeted network. APTs often use social engineering tactics or exploit vulnerabilities to infect a system and can remain unnoticed for a significant time period. During the window between infection and remediation, an APT will often monitor, intercept, and relay communications and sensitive data. APTs are well-sourced, persistent application of a wide variety of intrusion technologies and malware to selected targets. These targets are often of a business or political nature. The attacks are often attributed to state-sponsored organizations and criminal enterprises. They differ from other types of attack by their careful target selection and stealthy intrusion efforts over extended periods. Some of the high-profile attacks that fall into this category include Aurora, RSA, APT1, and Stuxnet. We'll talk about a couple of these in a bit more detail. APTs get their name as a result of possessing three characteristics. They are advanced, they are persistent, and they are threats. Let's examine the characteristics a bit more closely. In terms of being advanced, attackers use a wide variety of intrusion technologies, including development of custom malware if necessary. The individual components may not be technically advanced, but are carefully selected to suit the chosen target. Hence, being advanced means it's a sophisticated type of attack. With respect to persistent, there's a determined application of attacks over an extended period against the chosen target in order to maximize chance of success. They may progressively and stealthily apply a variety of attacks until the target is compromised. Hence, persistence means it's ongoing. And finally, threats. Threats to selected targets as a result of organized, capable, and well-funded attackers' intent to compromise the specifically chosen targets. There's active involvement of people in the process greatly raises the threat level, from that due to automated attack tools and the likelihood of successful attack. We had mentioned APT1. There's an American cybersecurity firm named Mandiant, and Mandiant has been acquired by a company called FireEye. Mandiant rose to prominence in February of 2013 when it released a report directly implicating China in cyber espionage. This security firm of Mandiant tracks several APTs over a period of 7 years, all originating in China, specifically Shanghai and the Pudong region. These APTs were simply named APT1, APT2, and so on. If you're interested in detail investigating this, conduct an online search for APT1 espionage report. Let's consider in a little more detail how these APT attacks originate and what the motivation is. The aim of an APT attack varies from the theft of intellectual property or security and infrastructure-related data to the physical disruption of an infrastructure. The techniques used to initiate such an attack would be social engineering or spear phishing email, drive-by downloads. The idea is that the attacker must somehow get their malicious software into the system or gain access to the system. The intent is to infect the target with sophisticated malware with multiple propagation mechanisms and payloads. Once the adversary has gained initial access, a further range of attack tools are used to maintain and extend their access. So as a result, these attacks are much harder to defend against due to this specific targeting and persistence. It requires a combination of technical countermeasures as well as awareness training to assist personnel to resist such attacks. As the techniques indicated here really are addressing more of the personnel side of an organization rather than the technical side. So even with current best practice countermeasures, the use of zero-day exploits and new attack approaches means that some of these attacks are likely to succeed. Thus, multiple layers of defense are needed with mechanisms to detect, respond, and mitigate such attacks. So how does an APT attack proceed? What are the stages? The whole purpose of an attack is to gain ongoing access to the system. Hackers achieve this goal not in one attempt, but in a series of stages. These stages would be to initially gain access, establish a foothold, deepen access, move laterally within the system, look, learn, and remain. The hackers can attempt to keep this process running, possibly indefinitely, or withdraw once they accomplish a specific goal. They often leave a backdoor open to access the system again at some point in the future. Let's consider these steps in a bit more detail. Stage 1, gaining access. Similar to the way a burglar forces open a door with a crowbar, cyber criminals usually gain entry through a network, an infected file, junk email, or an app vulnerability to insert their malware into a target network. In terms of step 2, establishing a foothold, cyber criminals will implant malware that allows creation of a network of backdoors and tunnels to move around in systems undetected. This malware often employs techniques like rewriting code to help hackers cover their tracks. In terms of step 3, deepening their access, once inside, hackers use techniques such as password cracking to gain access to administrator rights. This allows them to control more of the system and get even greater levels of access. Step 4, moving laterally. Deeper inside the system with administrator rights, hackers can move around at will. They can attempt to access other servers and other secure parts of the network. And finally, stage 5, look, learn, and remain. From inside the system, hackers gain a full understanding of how it works and its vulnerabilities, allowing them to harvest information they want at will. The advanced persistent threat pursues its objectives repeatedly over an extended period. It adapts to the defender's efforts to resist it. Furthermore, it's determined to maintain the level of interaction needed to execute its objectives. An adversary that possesses sophisticated levels of expertise and significant resources is able to create opportunities to achieve its objectives by using multiple attack vectors. These objectives typically include establishing and extending footholds within the information technology infrastructure of the targeted organizations. The reasons being exfiltrating information, undermining or impeding critical aspects of a mission, program, or organization, or positioning itself to carry out these objectives in the future. Before we wrap up our introduction to malware and cyber attacks, let's recap what we've done in this video. We introduced a great deal of terminology related to malicious software and malware. We defined the term malware and indicated it could take a variety of different forms. We discussed how malware might enter a system and how it might spread. We also mentioned some reasons for malware, what goals an attacker might have, or what they might wish to achieve through the deployment of malware. We discussed the idea of an attack kit and introduced this notion that cybercrime has become a big business. We also examined in some detail a form of attack called an advanced persistent threat. In our next video, we'll continue our investigation of malware and cyber attacks by investigating viruses.